All right, it looks like we have most of everyone that's going to be here. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the second session in our advocacy webinar series, The Legislative Process, hosted by myself and our very own Julie Howell. Next slide, please. A few reminder, today's webinar will be recorded and is available for viewing on pva.org. Closed captioning is available. Please click on the CC button in the meeting controls bar at the bottom of your screen to turn it on. If you have any questions, please feel free to type into the Q&A box. Questions will be answered at the end of the program. Next slide, please. I'm Lisa Elijah, PVA's Grassroots Advocacy Manager. I'm an Air Force vet and a PVA member.
All right. Hello, everybody. For those that don't know me, my name is Julie Howell. I'm an Associate Legislative Director here at PVA, and I am an Army veteran. I'm going to cover just like last time, a few things, just get it out of the way. This is not going to be a comprehensive civics course. We don't really have the time or the capacity to make that happen. This is also not going to become a place to debate politics or personal beliefs. This is not going to be a forum for debate. What this is a very brief overview of the structures of our government. It's going to be a refresher course for those of you that may want it. And essentially, it's going to be a 30,000-foot view of our current system. Just a quick overview from our last session. Last time we covered the fundamentals of government, covered the three branches. So the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. We briefly discussed local, state, and federal government structures and how similar they are to one another. And we also covered a bicameral Congress, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Today's going to be our second session together where we're going to cover the legislative process. After today's webinar, there's going to be 3 more sessions, which you can see here on the screen. We're going to get all the information out to everybody about when the next one is coming up. So keep an eye on your inbox, but just take brief note that it looks like our next session is going to be on Thursday, June 22nd at 3 p.m. So basically same bat channel. All right, I'm going to pass it on over to Lisa to take it away.
Thanks, Julie. All right, I think most of us have seen Schoolhouse Rock's video on how a bill becomes a law. While copyright doesn't allow us to play this video in this session, we will be including it in the reference material to view on your own time. It does a fantastic job of breaking down the process, and I encourage all of you to watch it. When we are speaking about the creation of a bill, it always starts out as an idea. Members of Congress and their staff will gain insight from either requests initiated through their constituents or from hearings and meetings. I can't stress enough how important meetings with your representatives' offices are because of this fact. Advocacy groups like PVA play a huge role in developing legislation. We give ideas and even write the legislation for the office. It is very common for this to be the case. In fact, anyone can come up with and write a bill, but only members of Congress can introduce the legislation. They are conduits for getting things passed into law, but we as individuals play a very important part. Next slide, please. Once the idea for a bill is in place, offices go into research mode on the best ways to draft a legislation. They need to consider ways of solving the issue that was presented while also trying to help serve the greatest number of people. Staffers are the ones behind the scenes doing the footwork. We have a wide array of priorities they are responsible for, and it's not going to be possible for them to know everything on the subject. Offices rely heavily on knowledge and insight from outside sources. They will speak to think tanks, advocacy groups such as PVA, constituents with life experience, and the Congressional Research Service, which is a partner of the legislative branch that has subject matter experts that will give non-biased information. Once they have all the information necessary for creating a bill, the request is then sent to Legislative Council to draft the language of the bill. I think it's incredibly important to note that oftentimes it is an advocacy group or a lobbyist who will do the research, draft the bill, then seek an office to introduce their bill. This type of situation is more the case in the disability side of things rather than on the veteran side for policy. A great example of this is the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act, which our very own Heather Ainsley heavily drafted. Next slide, please. Once the bill is drafted, more work needs to be done. A bill simply existing is not enough to get it past the finish line. In order to gain traction, bills need support, and this support needs to come from inside as well as outside of Congress. A lot of offices will float their bill through advocacy groups and try to gain endorsements to show that the bill is needed and that a large number of constituents agree with the language. Usually an endorsement is needed before another office will choose to support the bill. Sometimes two offices agree to draft a bill together, but that is usually not the case. If an office gets sponsors, which is the goal to have bipartisan support, it's ready to be introduced for consideration. If an office is pushing for the bill to pass quickly, they also try to reach out to offices in respective chambers for joint introduction, meaning the House and the Senate are introducing it at the same time. A few days after introduction, the bill should show up on congress.gov, where the language, the sponsors, and any companion bills may be located. The first place the bill will be reviewed is by a committee, and I'll pass it off to Julie to speak more on this subject.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, so what is a committee? We hear this word a lot. It's pretty simple. It's a group of members that are appointed to investigate, debate, and report on legislation. Fun fact, the first committee was created in 1789, and while they're not mentioned in the Constitution, committees have become a critical part of our government. Historically, as more and more legislation was getting introduced, it was decided that by breaking up the chambers into area of focus, that would help distribute the work. There's 5 types of committees: standing, subcommittees, select, joint, and then the committees of the whole. I'm going to cover 4 of them briefly. A standing committee is the most common. They consider bills and review legislation. An example of a standing committee is the House and Senate Veteran Affairs Committees. Within standing committees are smaller committees called subcommittees. An example of that are the Health and Economic Opportunity subcommittees under the House Veteran Affairs Committee. Next up are select committees. They temporarily are created with a timeline to complete a very specific task, like investigating a government entity. Rather than researching and reporting bills to the House floor, they research specific issues or oversee a government agency. An example of a select committee is the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in the House and the Select Committee on Intelligence in the Senate. Next up are joint committees, which are made up of members from both chambers. Joint committees debate and report on matters concerning the Congress rather than specific issues of public policy. Because they consider only matters affecting the Congress, such as organizing an inauguration ceremony, they don't consider legislation or report it to either chamber. For example, there's a joint committee of the Congress. It's kind of a tricky title. The Joint Committee of Congress on the Library, which is the oldest continuing joint committee in Congress. It was created in 1802, and it conducts oversight of the operations of the Library of Congress, the management of the National Statuary Hall Collection, the U.S. Botanic Gardens, and all of the fine arts in the Capitol. Just another fun fact for you. So just a quick overview of the makeup of the House and Senate where committees are concerned. The House has 20 standing committees, 104 subcommittees, and 3 select committees. The Senate has 16 standing committees, 70 subcommittees, and 5 select committees. Additionally, there are currently 4 joint committees. Now, PVA works with a bunch of different committees in both chambers. A few of the committees we engage with most often are probably the House and Senate Veteran Affairs Committee, probably for obvious reasons. But we also engage a lot with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee, or the HELP Committee. Also, we work with the Ways and Means Committee, the Senate Finance Committee, and even Energy and Commerce. Now, I mentioned earlier that committees are not actually part of the Constitution, and therefore there's no set number of how many committees there needs to be. They change in number and form with each new Congress as decided by the majority party for the efficient consideration of legislation. Now, a committee's jurisdiction is a specific policy area on a topic where a subcommittee digs more in depth into issues under that broader topic. So think of a committee as an umbrella, and the subcommittees fall under different buckets under that umbrella. So one example is the House Committee on Ways and Means. They focus on tax issues, but they have subcommittees that focus on things like Social Security and trade. So a little bit about committee assignments. Where does that come from? Generally speaking, when a member comes in, they express interest in the committees they would prefer to work on. So usually they'll request access to an issue area that they have experience in or an area that's important to their constituents. So say a new member has a high veteran population. Maybe they want to work on the Veteran Affairs Committee because it's important to their constituency. Or maybe they've got a military base and so they ask to be on the Armed Services Committee. That's generally speaking the type of way that committee assignments get doled out. And it's always up to leadership to assign those. Now, committees are led by whichever party has the current majority. So Republicans are the majority in the House for the 118th Congress. So every committee in the House and every subcommittee, the current ranking member or the chairwoman or the chairman for all of those committees is going to be a Republican. And because Democrats have the majority in the Senate, that rule sits true in the Senate. Democrats are the chair people for all of the committees in the Senate. Now, generally speaking, the chair and ranking member are usually the highest ranking person with the most experience on that committee. So let's use the House Veteran Affairs Committee as an example again. The current chairman is Congressman Mike Bost. Now, last Congress, he was the ranking member when the Republicans were in the minority. So generally speaking, that flip will occur as long as everybody maintains their committee assignments. So for a little bit of subcommittee logistics, as Lisa mentioned, the first time we hear about a bill is usually at a subcommittee pending legislation hearing. This is an opportunity for members to listen to the merits of a proposed bill. They invite experts to testify on behalf of those bills. So that's often where PVA and other VSOs go to offer testimony, either in support of, in opposition of, or maybe we have some ideas to make a bill better. But when you hear about us participating in hearings, that's generally the type of thing that's going on. We're talking about the merits of bills. Bills can be accepted, amended, or rejected. There's not really like a set way for this to happen. Bills can be debated back and forth behind the scenes, but there's always an opportunity for additional debate. And again, it's rarely a one and done situation. Often there's a lot of discussions behind the scenes. And sometimes there's official amendments offered in these very strict and prescribed areas, but often those debates go on behind the scenes. If a bill gets passed through the subcommittee level, then it's given to the full committee. So very similar there. If a bill is approved out of the subcommittee, it's offered in a full committee markup. So during a markup, the process is pretty much the same as we just said, but this is where more members of the committee are present. So generally speaking, more than a majority of the committee members are all there to have a broader discussion about these bills. More changes can be made. It's where you fine tune everything. And if the full committee votes the bill through, it's reported to the floor of the House or the Senate, and the majority party decides when to place the bill on the calendar for consideration. So consideration and debate. For the House of Representatives, after a bill has been reported out of a subcommittee and through the full committee, it can be considered by the House floor. Under some circumstances, though, I want to make sure that we recognize this, like in the case of a national emergency or something like that, sometimes bills don't have to go through the committee process. They just go straight to the floor for a vote, but it's pretty rare. It's got to be a pretty big deal for that to happen. And this says governed by a rule. A rule is a simple resolution that the House passes outlining the debate procedures of a bill. So things like how much time will be allowed for debate. Generally speaking, in the House, that's 5 minutes per member. The rules about the amendment process and other steps. Usually, the opponents and supporters of a bill are already known, so members can step up to offer their opinion on the matter. During this process is, again, additional opportunities to offer amendments or debates. So after debate, the House is ready to vote on final passage. Sometimes there's going to be a voice vote, or that's what we mean when we say the yeas and the nays. Sometimes they'll use their electronic voting system. Once the votes are in, if it passes through, the bill is off to the Senate. For legislation to clear the House, you need a majority in support. Now, for the Senate, the process is similar, but there's also a little bit of variation. So the majority leader schedules a bill for debate, and the leader can request unanimous consent, which means that if all senators agree on the bill, they can vote it through without any debate. But when a UC has been called, if a single senator objects, that UC has failed. And then a motion to consider is filed and the legislation is brought to the floor for debate and votes. Now, generally speaking, the Senate has unlimited debate time. This means that as long as a senator is standing, speaking, and does not leave the chamber, no action can be taken. And this usually happens among a minority group to prevent the passage of a bill. This probably sounds vaguely familiar. This is what we call the filibuster. The filibuster dates back to the 1850s, and these days we use the term to reference prolonged debate or delay tactics. And generally it's used to prevent a bill from passing. Now, that obviously was burdensome. It took up a lot of time. So in 1917, the Senate created a rule that allows a 2/3 majority to end the filibuster. And this is what is known as cloture. So if cloture passes, the debate time is over and a simple majority of votes will pass the bill through the chamber. You'll hear it on the news every once in a while. They filed for cloture. And so I just wanted to make sure that that word stood out for you. Generally speaking, for a bill to pass the Senate, you need a 60 vote threshold to get it through. Cloture is sort of a backdoor to that. And then in theory, as long as everyone passes it through, then the bill is off to be signed by the president. Okay, so I just want to take a second to talk about this infographic. I think this is brilliant and it does a great job of describing why things can be as difficult as they are. I mean, for me, this looks like a high stakes game of chutes and ladders. There's so many steps involved that it's kind of amazing that we ever pass any legislation at all. I know that at times it seems exhausting and that it feels like our government works excruciatingly slow. But it's important to remember that all of these steps are very intentional. This process allows thorough debate, appropriate enforcement, and the pace is intentional so that we aren't too quick to pass bills that could cause a bunch of harm. It's also one of the issues, this whole process is one of the reasons you often get emails from us about our voter voice campaigns or the Action Alert Network. Look at all of these steps. Sometimes a bill can get hung up and sometimes it just needs a little bit of, extra oomph behind it to draw attention to it and get it over some hurdles. And so when we flag those out for you guys, oftentimes your voice really matters in helping us avoid one of these many steps or get it past that hiccup. And this will be available to you guys. It's worth taking a dig into this to understand just how complicated it is and how when we do pass a bill, it's such a big deal. All right, I just talked a lot, so let's give it back to Lisa.
Thanks, Julie. All right, so a bill must pass both chambers before it goes to the president for consideration. The Constitution requires both bills to have the same wording, but this rarely happens. A conference committee is convened from members of both chambers to produce a committee report. Depending on the origin of the bill, the final text is then enrolled by the House clerk or the Secretary of the Senate. The bill is then presented to the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate for signatures. And once passed, the bill is presented to the President of the United States. The President has a few choices once the bill gets to them. They can agree and sign the bill into law, but if they don't agree, they may veto it and send it back to Congress. Congress may then override the veto with a 2/3 vote in each chamber, where the bill will then become a law without having to go back to the President. But if it doesn't pass, it's not going to go anywhere. If Congress is in session and the president takes no action within 10 days, the bill also becomes a law. But if Congress adjourns before 10 days and the president takes no action, the bill dies and Congress cannot vote to override. This is called a pocket veto. Next slide, please. The legislative branch has a lot of power in terms of our government and how it is shaped, and it's imperative to have oversight at every level. The legislative branch wants to make sure that the executive branch isn't using its power unwisely, and the same can be said for the legislative branch. To counteract this, there are committees in place in the House and Senate. The House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform ensures the efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability of the federal government, and they are the main investigative committee for the House. They are also the only one in the House that has the power to issue a subpoena. And then there's the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. They're also known as HISGAC. It's responsible for matters related to DHS and other Homeland Security concerns, along with the functionings of the government itself. HISGAC serves as the chief investigative and oversight committee for the Senate, and they too can serve subpoenas. Both are in charge of dedicated to overseeing and reforming government operations. Much in the same way, the Government Accountability Office is the oversight of Congress. They audit and generate unbiased reports on every aspect of the government. GAO tries to ensure that tax dollars are spent effectively and efficiently. There are 64 inspector generals. They regularly audit and report on the agencies they're attached to in an unbiased manner. Sometimes it's through these reports that new bills are actually created. It's important to note that every agency has IGs, not just in the GAO. Next slide, please. Every spring, the president releases their budget plan to Congress on where money should be allocated and what their priorities should be. A lot of times you will hear it referred to as the PBR, or Presidential Budget Request. The fiscal year runs from October 1st of one calendar year to September 30th of the next. It benefits Congress to run on the fiscal calendar year because during the regular year, almost no legislation moves in December. During the beginning of the year, other agencies include what they see as funding needed, such as Defense, the VA, or other federal agencies. PBA noticed a shortfall on some budget allocations from veteran issues, so we supplement this through a joint effort with DAV and VFW through what we call the independent budget. Next slide, please. The two major areas I want to lightly touch on with the budget are discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is anything that is subject to the appropriations process, where Congress sets a new funding level each fiscal year for programs covered in an appropriations bill. So just a reminder, October of one year, September to the next. About 1/3 of all activities from the federal government are funding through appropriations. Discretionary spending will not occur unless Congress acts each year to provide the funding through an appropriations bill, like that for national defense or a reauthorization, which I'll go into in the next slide. On the other hand, mandatory spending is simply all spending that does not take place through appropriations legislation. Mandatory spending accounts for about 2/3 of all federal spending. Things like Social Security is one example, as well as interest on any outstanding debt falls into the mandatory spending. Next slide, please. Budget reauthorizations of funding happen at various times in an effort to alleviate unnecessary issues. There are 12 appropriation subcommittees for the various discretionary funding issues in our national budget. Not every authorization happens every year, although the national defense authorization does, due to the sheer size of the budget and its national defense importance. Other areas vary in time. For example, the Federal Aviation Administration is every 5 years. When an authorization expires, Congress may choose to extend the life of a program by passing legislation referred to as a reauthorization. It's much easier to get priorities through in a reauthorization than a simple standalone bill. One example of this would be the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act. We've been trying to get this amendment passed for years, but it's much easier to get it into a larger package, such as a reauthorization, and it holds so much importance and time constraint. All right, next slide, please. Okay, that was a lot. Let's take a moment to process what we learned, and I'm going to pass it off to Heather Ainsley, our Associate Executive Director of Government Relations, to moderate our Q&A.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Appreciate that. So we've heard a lot of good information here. I'm wondering, Julie, if you could maybe just start real briefly by telling us of the actual example where this has worked out, and some time where we've actually used this whole process.
Sure, thanks for that. I think everybody that's on the call probably remembers a little bill called the MAMO Act, the Making Advances in Medical Options That was the bill that increased access to accessible mammography. So we're actually rolling up on the 1-year anniversary on the passage of the Mammo Act, and PVA worked on this bill through several Congresses. My predecessor, actually, at a pending pending legislation hearing, highlighted the need for there to be an increase in accessible mammography, particularly for our women PVA members. And because of her testimony and her subject matter expertise in this, they wrote in accessibility language to an iteration of the Mammo Act. And so that happened in the 116th. And then last Congress, the 117th, we were able to, again, speak on behalf of the bill in a pending legislation hearing. We were able to advocate for the passage of that bill. And then we saw it cross the finish line thanks to our members, making the calls, sending the letters, being engaged. And so the Mammo Act is a perfect example of PVA being engaged in a bill from start to finish. So we were there, boots on the ground, making sure that language for our members was highlighted in the bill and that they're included in the strategic plan as it rolls out. And we saw it all the way to the signing of the White House. And again, here we are a year out, and we had a wonderful conversation with VA just last week about how they're excited about all of the provisions that are going to impact our members. So from start to finish.
Thanks, Julie. So if there are others who have questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of your control panel. And just as a reminder, these are questions about the topics that we've had here. If you need to connect with us on advocacy issues or other policy questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us offline, and we'll make sure that our contact information is included in the chat. So we had a question about, with all of the information in the media right now about the budget and financing the government, how does that really work? That you all kind of gave the, I'll call it the how the bill becomes a law version in terms of the budget. But we all know, I think, that it's been a lot more difficult. So, it's really kind of complicated, but it seems like here lately we fund the government based on various deals that we can come up with. And there's lots of concerns about capping federal spending, how we're going to use mandatory funds that Lisa mentioned, discretionary funds. The government was funded for this fiscal year, which we're in fiscal year 23. It started in October of FY22. They did a continuing resolution that kept us chugging along until we got to December. And then we ended up passing an omnibus bill, which basically said, here's all the agencies, all their funding, and we're just going to include this at once. They're supposed to pass individual appropriations bills. There are 12 individual appropriations bills. The VAs is what we call the MILCON VA. So it's Military Construction VA. There's THUD, which is Transportation and Housing and Urban Development. So we have these cute names for all these appropriations bills that Congress unfortunately doesn't frequently pass as standalone bills. So what we're in right now, as I said, came about from an omnibus. What you're hearing about now in the media in terms of the deal related to whether or not the Congress is going to raise the debt limit gets into what are we going to do for future years. So for FY24 funding, which will start in October of this year, October of 2023 is when the next fiscal year starts. What kind of, how will that be funded? And the answer right now is we don't know. There's some ideas that they're getting ready to consider in Congress, but nothing is concrete yet. But it's possible that they may look at some level of capping. We're not going to spend over X amount of percent on our funding for the next fiscal year. Mandatory funds, as Lisa mentioned, is a huge part of the budget. So like VA benefits, mandatory spending, Medicare, Social Security, all mandatory spending. And then you have the discretionary, which includes non-defense discretionary for things like Department of Justice and transportation, housing and urban development, and then defense discretionary, which of course funds the national defense. So lots of different ways in which people try to look at, well, can we make sure that, you know, on our discretionary side, that the defense side matches the non-defense side. Concerns about, well, what do we do with mandatory spending? As was mentioned, it's 2/3 of the budget, and yet it's been primarily off the table, which, you know, if that's going to harm folks, then, you know, then that may be the best solution for now. But there is a lot of uncertainty just in terms of every year. It seems like we walk up to the ledge and then we look over, and usually they decide to keep going along by coming up with some arrangements that are not passing the 12 spending bills in the House, passing the 12 in the Senate, coming to a conference, and then having the president to actually sign off on that particular legislation. So definitely, if you want to see how this is playing out, and in not so much in how a bill becomes a law, but how in Congress is legislating these days, definitely stay tuned to your news and watch C-SPAN later this afternoon, whether that's online or on TV, and you'll be able to see a little bit of this, you know, coming out into action. So we have another question here. And maybe Lisa, you could handle this one for us. You know, we threw around terms like the 118th Congress, the 116th Congress. What does all that mean?
That's a great question. It's the various Congress of when one session closes. And so any open bills that are a part of that Congress, when it closes out, they have to reintroduce them. So last year we had the 117th Congress. This year we have the 118th that goes until 2024, I believe. And then, so one of those, as we had noticed, you've been seeing probably a lot of emails on this, like the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act. We had it last year. We had to have it reintroduced this year because it's a whole brand new Congress. So 117th closed out. Any open bills that did not get passed, did not get signed into law, they have to reintroduce them if they want them to go through. So that's essentially kind of a brief overview of that. It's just kind of a way of renewing it, and new senators, new House of Representatives come in. But it's definitely a way for us to, it's something to make important when you hear that note, because you know, something is stating, oh, we passed this in 2017, now new bills have to come in. So just make sure to keep that in mind.
Yep, that's good to know. And important for us to keep in mind as we use terms that a lot of folks here in DC throw around like water. And I was just visiting my relatives who live in Alabama, and it was great to remember that not everybody lives and breathes politics, and that there's a lot else happening outside the Beltway. But I know that one of the things that mentioned was MAMO and our, you know, how we can, you know, the role that members can play in helping to get legislation like that passed. And certainly we had another big victory last year that provided a second automobile grant for folks that, you know, would be able to, you know, help those who have a service-connected disability who previously received an auto grant be able to get a new one. How can folks weigh in terms of, you know, being able to be a part of getting legislation passed? I'm going to ask you, Lisa, if you could respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing you probably heard quite a bit us speak on is the PVA Action Force. It's our system that we use in order to pass letters to our legislators. Usually when a bill has been introduced and either we're looking for sponsors or we're just hoping to advocate to get those individuals to vote for our bill, we'll send out that alert to our members so that they can send a letter to their respective senators, representatives, to try and get on and to push that through. It's incredibly important in terms of your voice. They rely heavily on the needs of you because you are the ones that vote them into office. You are the ones that are telling them what you need because they represent you. That is their sole responsibility, essentially, is to be your voice in terms of that legislative Congress. So when you're telling them that you need something, then those letters are what pushes that through. So a lot of times we'll send out notices, or even if you sign up with PVA Action Force, you can sign up and we'll give you like emails, notifications, things like that. All you have to do is click on that button. It has a pre-written letter already that you can send to your legislators and telling them like, I need you to support this. This is important for me. This is something that affects me directly and I need it. And you can either leave it as it is, or you can actually customize a letter as well and tell them the reasons why. And actually it's incredibly important, and it brings a lot of power and emphasis when you are editing those letters, because they read through every single one. I was in these offices doing this as well. And so it is not something you need to take lightheartedly. If we're asking for them, it's so important that you do that, because you are helping us as PVA, as yourself, of getting these things across. And so when we're asking for it, it's not just a light request. It's important, and it's something that you can really do in order to push legislation across. This is how you use your voice, not only when you're talking about issues that you want a bill introduced, but when it is introduced, this is where it gets pushed through.
So Lisa, I know that a question we had was, where can you find out information about PVA through PVA Action Force? Where can you look at all of the upcoming bills? And I know there's a feature in Voter Voice, which is our platform for PVA Action Force, to look at the various bills that PVA is supporting. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the bill tracker?
Yes, so we have a bill tracker on our PVA in our Voter Voice application for it, which is also where you would find for writing out letters. And it lists all of the various bills that we are supporting, and a few against. There are very few that we have, but that we're against, but usually those are in terms of like civil rights, things that we don't want to have issues with. So I will post the link in just a moment, but if you go there, you click on it, it'll show all the bills that are relevant to us, and then the topics that they're from, whether it's transportation, benefits, VA housing, women veterans, all of those things that have been introduced that we've looked through, that we support in its language. And not all of them have letters on them, but I encourage you, if there's something that you find important that you would like to, go ahead and do so. But that's where you'd be able to look at that and see like our representation, as well as another quick note. If you look at our legislative priorities, everyone that's in that kind of bill section, they will kind of touch on our legislative priorities in some way or another.
Great. So we had another question about where people can find information about relevant laws for paralyzed veterans. So I'll say that go to PVA's website, pva.org. We have a tab called Veterans and Disability Advocacy. And under that, we have veterans issues, our policy priorities, which includes everything that we're currently working on, the independent budget, which we talked about earlier today, disability rights and advocacy, the Americans with Disabilities Act, air travel accessibility, voting accessibility. So a wide variety of areas that we focus on. And there's a lot of good information there, including fact sheets that we've developed, particularly with disability advocacy. If you have questions on the VA side, we would encourage you, of course, to contact your National Service Officer, who can assist you in filing for any VA benefits or answering any questions that you might have about dealing with the Department of Veterans Affairs. But that is one way that you can, take a look at some of the information that is available. We also had a couple of questions about how can you propose an issue for PVA to introduce into consideration. So one thing you can certainly do is to work with your local chapter. PVA has 33 chapters around the country, and we do encourage folks to belong to and work with their chapter so that they can stay up to date on what's happening with policy issues, but also so that they can work with their chapter to make those recommendations to us. We also would encourage you, if you have specific things you want to consider, to reach out to us directly. I put my information in the chat. We also, Julie put hers as well, but don't hesitate to reach out, and we would certainly be happy to see if something has already been introduced. There may already be something in the works, or something that we can do to help with the idea that you have. Sometimes things are best addressed at the state or local level, depending on the issue. Sometimes it's a federal only solution. And then other times legislation may not be the answer at all. It may be instead working with an agency of some kind, or maybe working directly, if it's a disability access issue, maybe it's working directly with the business itself. So there may be lots of different ways to figure out how best to go about getting that to be introduced. So I saw that we had one comment that was about, we have voter voice and it makes it easy to send letters, but is there an advantage to, maybe pulling out the stationery and, writing a letter, in your own handwriting and mailing to your member of Congress? Lisa, you most recently worked in a Senate office. Can you tell us how that kind of issues are typically addressed?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, it's more in line with us getting emails and digital types of letters now than we do handwritten letters. And so it's become almost a special thing to be able to get those and to open them up. It's very important, and usually it should be the case for every office, is to then send back a letter notifying them that we received it and just letting them know it was important to us and the information that they gave us, and especially when you write about your firsthand experience and you talk about the ways that this bill is affecting you. Those are the ones that are the most rememberable, the ones that I keep closest to my heart. And a lot of times that's where they write very personal letters back to the constituents on, because they care about your experience and the things you go through. And so if you're writing to them, and if you're taking the time, especially to handwrite something, it goes a huge, long way. Even if you're faxing, whatever the case, they care for you to reach out to them, but those little personalized touches really, they stand out.
Kind of a follow-up to that, Lisa, how would you rate, is it sometimes the quantity of how many people for or against reach out something, is that what makes the difference? Or is it maybe a compelling story? What do you think usually kind of puts the issue over the edge?
If it's something that a lot of people have written in about, then it's something where it's like, okay, we'll pay attention to this. We know it's an important topic for our constituents. But the personalized messages, the ones that have a really heartfelt, really like in-depth view of why this is affecting them, why it is important, and what needs to be changed about it, those are the ones that I will say any office you speak to, they will remember the most. Those are the ones generally where they're really trying to move and try to get either they'll sign on to a bill, or they'll actually create legislation based on those experiences, because they really truly do care about your experiences. And if you're having an issue, and a lot of times they have so many wide issues that they can't possibly know every single thing that's going on. And so they're really going to rely heavily on you in order to tell them what you need, what the issue is, and how it is that they can best serve you and fix it.
So a follow-up question that we had was, if we have somebody who can help write these letters. So maybe you could talk a little more, Lisa, about how folks can use the letters that are in our PVA Action Force, and even how they could use those to handwrite their own letters.
Yeah, absolutely. So within PBA on the Action Force, I did want to mention this because I put it in the chat, but I know not always, especially with closed captioning, where not all readers and assistive devices can read the chat as easily. So if you go to our PVA Action Force and you scroll down to the right-hand side, you can view key legislation, and that's where you can find all of our bills. But in terms of writing a letter, also on that same area, you have kind of key legislation that we're really trying to push for right now. Huge one right now, just because of the reauthorization, is the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act. We also have, we're really trying to push for community-based services. if you click on that and then you look over onto the right-hand side, there's a message that's already drafted for you. So if you don't want to do it through the voter voice system and you would like to take that information and then use it in a handwritten letter, you do that, but all for it, because either way, that's what we're wanting, is for you to reach out to them and write your letter about what is important to you. And especially if you're handwriting it, then a lot of times you are going to be easily able to put in your own personalized touches to it, as well as sign it. And it just it adds a little bit to it. So I would say, yes, you can do that. We are more than happy. It's just sometimes a voter voice, it's a quick way of doing it. If you have a link, because we'll send emails, you just click on the link, you just put in your information. If you're signed up for voter voice action alerts already, it'll include all of your information. Even better, you just hit send. It's pretty one click stop shop. But handwritten letters, I'm all for it. Go for it that way. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to help you out with that too.
Well, thanks, Lisa. And handwritten may just be something that you dictate, if that's what works best for you. And it's still a printed letter, but it comes from the heart. They can clearly tell it's not a form letter, and that this is something that you really care about. That's all that really matters. And you can always also pick up the phone. Some of the offices are hard to get through these days, particularly on the Senate side, but you can always pick up the phone and call to ask to speak to your, you're going to speak with the staff person, but you can record for the staff person will record, how you feel about a particular issue, and make sure that gets included in the information that the member of Congress is considering. So, Lisa, with that, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right, thanks, Heather. So that concludes our second webinar series, the legislative process. For participants viewing the recording that would like credit, please email the code 2A2LG to myself at lisae@pva.org. Make sure to join us next time on Thursday, June 22nd at 3 p.m., where we will be covering understanding the issues and becoming a change agent. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.